tolerators. This is To All the Men I've Tolerated Before with Natalie Katona, your weekly look at everyday misogyny. Today, we are welcoming a new friend to the team. Ray is an author of dark fiction, and I was drawn to asking her to be on the show because of the title of one of her latest books, I Do Not Apologize for My Position on Men. We will be talking about writing Sapphic horror and the importance of queer literature, especially under this administration and these trying times. Thanks for coming on the show, Ray.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for reaching out. It's such a great fit, I think, with a lot of the themes that I write about and talk about on the internet anyway.
Yes, my copy came of I Do Not Apologize for My Position on Men on Friday, and I haven't had a lot of time to read this weekend because of other stuff going on, but I have like 4 of the stories read, and I was like, yes, women's existence is nothing if but a horror movie played out again and again and again.
Yeah, totally. So, and I'd love to kind of dig into that if you're up for it, unless you want to kind of ease us in.
No, I'm up for it. I was going to give you a chance to introduce yourself and give a little background on you, but if you want to go deep first, I'm into it.
Oh, well, I'll be quick with my intro. So I'm Ray Wild. I'm a queer author living, unfortunately, in the red state of Florida. I have some books published under my former pen name, Ray Knowles. So you may have picked up Merciless Waters along the way. And I'm very interested in the lives of women and how we're impacted by the patriarchal society that we're living under, and the ways that different folks find to kind of cope with that. And those are a lot of things that I explore in my writing. And when I say cope, I mean that both positively and negatively.
Right. Because again, I can cope with an entire bag of Starburst jelly beans, or I could cope by just like screaming violently. And both are sometimes less healthy, but more valid than the other.
Right, right. And I think one of the copes that I explore in some of my stories is this tendency for women to sometimes seek a measure of power by siding with the oppressor, which is a really interesting thing that we see happen all too commonly. I think we just saw it in the most recent election where overwhelmingly white women voted against their own interests. But I think that plays out in a lot of different ways beyond just the explicitly political sphere, and it can permeate quite a bit, I think, into our daily lives.
It's so funny that you bring that up because I've been going through this lovely little pattern where I'll be either one on one or in a group of only women. And that woman will be very stripped down and honest about her current situation with a relationship with a man. And you'll be like, yeah, no, that is either the abuse cycle or inappropriate behavior or anything like that. And then you get like out of the group of women and you go back to her and she says something like, I mean, I just don't know. I'm so in love. I could have 50 more years with him. And you're like, really? I go, because I got an outline of what this year has looked like, and it wasn't anything I'd sign up for 50 more. And I literally say things like, that sounds like that can't be true. Like,
Yeah.
and I think the way that women have been conditioned to just push it down and forgive men led to our current trying times because they do just side with them against their own better interest.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for people to be critical about their beliefs. And I think we can look at it even in less clear cut situations. So like an example I'm seeing right now play out on social media especially is this massive sort of smear campaign against Blake Lively. And by no means am I like a Blake Lively stan, but I think we're seeing something similar play out that we saw play out with Amber Heard, which is a few underlying assumptions working together at once. One of them is that for us to believe that anything bad has happened to a woman, she needs to be the quote unquote perfect woman, which, as we know, doesn't exist. I think it's challenging in the social media landscape. For nuance to exist. That's not an idea I'm coming up with. I think that's something we talk about a lot. But I don't think that when things like this circulate and pick up a lot of traction, that folks always apply that logic, right? So we should be able to hold in our mind two things, so we can know that Blake Lively has done some really shitty, problematic stuff and still acknowledge that maybe she was sexually harassed in the workplace and that that is a bad thing. And it's been very clear and very public that Justin Baldoni has orchestrated a public smear campaign against her. But that's not really spoken about, even though it's been very out in the open. What you see is all of this content around how Blake Lively is annoying and unlikable. And I think that when we're introduced to a narrative about how we don't like a woman, folks don't always take the time to question, like, okay, but is there real substance here? And is it possibly that this narrative is coming up now to minimize a situation like a sexual assault or sexual harassment claim? And so, yeah, I mean, I've kind of gotten us off track a little bit, but I think there are all these examples that people don't necessarily look critically at. And I personally immediately get worried when I see a woman at the center of what seems like a very widespread takedown effort. I start to go, ooh, what powerful man did she challenge? Even if she's not great and has done other things, like we should be able to hold those two things at the same time.
No, I agree. And we touch on it a little bit at the end of our episode with Chris DeRosa about It Ends With Us, where I said, my greatest fear is that no matter what happened to just between Justin and Blake, um, it will set back legislation and legality for women 100 years, because that's exactly what happened with Amber. And I know women who have been personally affected by laws that have changed because of the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case. And whether or not, even I remember in the midst of the Amber Heard case, because when we're talking about men in my life or men in guest life, I always say, I go, you don't even have to say a name. Call him loser, call him one night stand from April. But then the Amber Heard trial went down and I went, well, shit. Now, if with the right text messages or date book entry in a calendar or anything, a dude can be like, Natalie talks shit about me on the internet for an hour and a half, and I'd like to take her for all the hundreds of dollars she's worth. Like,
Mm-hmm. Right. I think these things can set a really scary precedent. I think, neither you or I or anyone, the casual observer on the internet, can really know what happened. But I think what I would encourage folks to do is when you see a story like the Amber Heard trial or this case that's happening with Blake Lively right now, is to really think big picture about, okay, whether or not she is telling the truth, what is the lasting implication of this? And especially in an example this blatant, where we have in writing that this is an organized smear campaign to discredit this person, and it is still working on the scale that it is, I think that in and of itself is pretty frightening and something that people should be taking a harder look at. But I don't see a ton of that. I see a little bit of it, which is great, but mostly I see videos about how it'll be like some interview clip that's 10 years old of Blake Lively being like a little rude to an interviewer and just talking about how much we don't like this woman. And my thing is like, yeah, that's exactly the point, right?
well, and also it it's fascinating because when It Ends With Us started to bubble up that there was like drama between Blake and Justin, my initial gut reaction was, well, what gave Justin the right to want to tell a story that was so blatantly rooted in women's like experience and existence and the violence against women? And then he said, well, I have a podcast and I've solved toxic masculinity. And I'm like, mm. And then I'm always like, why aren't literally any woman who ever gets any acclaim has to do that through the misuse of her body, talent, mind, and heart? Taylor Swift is a big one who comes to mind. Beyonce, anyone, any woman who has ever been successful in their field. And yet Justin Baldoni built an entire brand on the backs of women's trauma and women's hurt. And it's the same reason I hate Ted Lasso, because they took the idea of toxic masculinity and went, what if we told everyone how toxic masculinity just really makes it so funny, but so weird for this group of good looking soccer players? And I was like, I talk about toxic masculinity every day and I'm bullied. I never get Emmys, so it must be nice. And then to also find out that Jason Sudeikis isn't the nicest of guys. And
Right.
so it's this whole idea of like, and it popped up again when Honora was getting all of the Oscar nominations, and it was praised as this movie that was like so pro woman and so pro sex work and all of it. But at the heart of it was a man. And I'm like, when are you ever going to let us just tell our own stories and realize that you have no right to them?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this question comes up quite a bit in the writing community in terms of like who should really be telling what stories. And I think it's a very complicated and nuanced question with a lot of room to explore gray area. But I know that I feel a certain way. For example, if I see books specifically on lists for things like feminine rage written by men. That's super challenging for me. And I think I would feel similarly if I saw like a Sapphic book written by a man do certain like, extremely well and blow books written by Sapphic authors out of the water. That's difficult. Um, and I think the other piece of that too is that I think we need to be super cautious and critical when we see a man with a platform, building that platform off the idea that he is a feminist. I don't think it's inherently a red flag, but I do think we need to not take those people at their word and look at their actions and see if how they're moving through the world is really in alignment with that framing, or if that is just a really convenient framing that will be abandoned the moment it's no longer beneficial to that person's career.
I don't know what pissed me off this week, but I do remember saying out loud, the way I'll know a man is an ally is when he's leaving us alone because he understands. Like, and then I was like, my brother in law only speaks on women's experiences when he has a really great one liner that is at its core making fun of how men have ruined the world. And I'm like, ally. Because for the most part, you leave me alone until you're like, aha, I have one witty thing to say. And then we all move on.
Yeah. The way that men engage with content about toxic masculinity, and I'm drawing mainly from my experiences online, is really interesting. I post a lot of content around that idea, and I see sort of two things happen, at least in my experience. When I directly post something negative about a certain type of man or negative about the general impact of patriarchy on the world, my first comments on the post almost every single time will be from men loudly agreeing with me I take that with a huge grain of salt. Like though that's sort of what I'm, and that's not to say that that's a sign that they are disingenuous. I'm just saying to me that's a sign to like look closer. Like I don't take that at face value. So there's that happens. And I don't actually get attacked a lot on those posts. What I find interesting is that where I really get attacked by men online is when I am speaking to a subject that has traditionally been a male dominated field and doing so with some kind of sense of confidence or authority. That is really when I will start to see some claws come out from men and see the kind of classic misogynistic tropes of like, oh, look, a woman wants attention online, or like, look, I have an opinion, even though I don't know what I'm talking about. These things, the tropes of like, you're stupid, you're not an expert, get out of, you're out of your lane, these kinds of things. So I find it really interesting and interesting that I will literally, even because I know that this will happen when I make a post like that, I will write in the caption like, I cannot wait for the men to come into this comment section. And they do not even have like the self-awareness to read that and go, let me not walk into this trap today. Like they're still going to walk into the trap. Because I think it's rooted in this deep insecurity and ultimately fear, that if a woman is more knowledgeable or doing better than them or more successful than them, that is some kind of condemnation on who they are, and all of that is patriarchal positioning.
And I think what has drawn me to horror for the last few years is the fact that when I watch a horror movie or I read a horror story, I see a lot of myself in the story. Like, take Barbarian. Well, maybe not Barbarian because it was created and directed by a man. Take Promising Young Woman.
Mm-hmm.
I'm watching Promising Young Woman, knowing that rape culture is very prevalent in my everyday, in my media, in my social media, in all of it. And I'm watching it, and I'm watching a woman who has somehow gotten herself right above that system and is now dealing out consequences to the men who take in part in that system. And I'm like, empowering. Or a movie like Ready or Not, where a bride is being hunted by her new husband's family because they've decided that she's a gold digger or something. And she's now dealing consequences because she's being attacked. So instead of taking the proactive role, it's still more of a final girl mindset. But at the end of the day, she's still victorious. And I see things like that. And I go, we are fighting these monsters every day. And horror has at least taken the second step and empowered us through it. But then we have movies like Men, where I left the movie theater and I was like, why did this movie just make fun of me for not enjoying the company of men? Like, I just felt made fun of the entire time. Like, oh, so dramatic. Like, guys aren't good looking enough and then you're scared. And I'm like, I mean, I'm scared of good looking guys too. Like,
Yeah. Men is a really interesting example because I first of all, I just want to say, let's pretend the ending never even happened because it was such a
a
bizarre
bizarre ending.
turn that, to be honest, I don't even want to get into it. Um, I thought that actually the initial sequences of Men did a viscerally incredible job at showing the everyday fear that can be involved in being a woman in the world. These small run ins that are unsettling, the feeling of walking alone and like checking over your shoulder and you're like pretty sure that there's someone behind you. Like those things are very real. And I think it actually did a really good job there. But I totally agree that there is sort of the good for her genre of horror that is super fun. And I think it's satisfying as a woman to have that kind of content, to see a woman come out on top, right? A woman that gets revenge. And I think that's kind of one way to look at it. I almost feel like Promising Young Woman, though, is a more realistic version of that because of the ending. And I suppose I won't, I don't know if I should spoil it. It's been
It's
out a
been
long
out
time.
so long. You can go ahead and spoil
Okay.
it.
So I kind of I love what they did where she is ultimately killed in pursuit of revenge, just because it it's gut wrenching, but like of course that is what would happen, like more than likely. If a woman in the world goes out and puts shady men in threatening situations, eventually, right, it's highly likely that she's going to come to harm. And I have an inkling that that ending is probably why the movie wasn't more popular than it was, because it is just devastating, the entire movie. But the other thing that I love that Promising Young Woman did was it shows within the film kind of every shade of this idea of a nice guy and the ways in which that they uphold the patriarchy. Because I think one thing that many men find challenging is that there seems to be this black and white thinking of like either you are a rapist or you have nothing to do with rape culture, and like this is a problem that sits over here, and like what could I possibly do, when in actuality there is an entire spectrum of ways that this rape culture is upheld in our society. And I think that film does a really good job showing a lot of different examples of how people can contribute to that without actually being the rapist.
Yeah. And I've had personal experiences where male friends of mine have come up to me, I guess because I'm the expert on misogyny, and or they're all afraid of me yelling at them, so they want to get ahead of it. And they know that their friend has done something that is in a gray area of some sort of assault or non-consensual act or whatever, and they're really torn up about it, and they go, "Well, Natalie, what do what do I do from here with this relationship that I have with this guy?" And I was like, "Yeah, welcome to the realization that every man you love could possibly at some point be the boogeyman." Like, I go, welcome to my everyday experience where from Garth Brooks to cousins to neighbors, I have to sit there and go, what day are you going to make a fool out of me for trusting you and letting you into my life? I go, because it happens, and it happens in very dramatic, awful ways.
And yes, and it can happen in very subtle, ambiguous ways. And I think in some ways that can be, it's obviously not more nefarious, but I think it is more widespread. And the impact of it, I think, contributes to the dismissal that we see from a lot of men of this really being a problem. And I'll give you an example of this sort of subtle thing that can happen. When I was going to publish my debut novel, so this is a couple years ago now, um, it was my very first book. I didn't really have like connections in the publishing world. And I was invited onto this podcast hosted by a man. And at the time, he was like pretty well known on social media, pretty well connected to authors that were way further advanced in their career than I was. So I was very excited about doing this podcast appearance. So the podcast host had private messaged me a number of times about the podcast, about the book, that he had received the book. And then he sends me a message that's something along the lines of, oh, I had a dream about you. And like immediately, like alarm bells are going off for me. I'm immediately super uncomfortable. Here is a man who has a measure of power in the, like I'm already booked on his show, like all of these things. And it's subtle. and it's ambiguous and there's plausible deniability in saying something like that. So I don't respond. Um, he goes on to say something about, oh, the dream was that I showed up at his house to like deliver this book to him. And so, the story itself isn't super important, but I think the end result is. So, like, the action I took is I reached out to other women that I had seen on this man's podcast. And I said, hey, this thing happened. It's sort of ambiguous, but it made me feel really uncomfortable. Has anything like this come up with you and this person? Right? Like, can I reality test this with you? And what I found was that not only had it come up with every single person I reached out to, it had come up almost in exactly the same way, in exactly the same language. So now, you go from looking at a situation that is so easily dismissed, right? If I had tried to run to, at the time it was Twitter was like the big whatever and been like, this guy said he had a dream about me. Can you imagine the hundreds of comments that I would receive from men going, you're such a bitch. Like that doesn't mean anything. You're trying to ruin this man. You know what I mean? But in actuality, this was someone who was wielding their power to try to get some kind of sexual kick out of like this veiled language. And in my mind, it's instances like that, those more gray situations that are way more common and tend to be what other men will excuse in the behavior of their family, friends, and even in themselves.
Yeah. I think one of the subtle ways that I watch misogyny play out in a very normalized, like you can very quickly brush it away and explain it away is how men will dehumanize us once we're a threat to their convenience or power or confidence. Like if we're how many statistics have we read about women who have been left by husbands after their second round of chemo? When women are tired from raising children that men want, then it's you're not sexy, you're boring, our marriage is on the rocks. This lack of empathy that we too are people who have days that we are living and experiences that we are going through because caring for us has caused them physical pain, or they're not getting sex as often as they wanted, or losing our job has caused them a financial strain, or us learning more about ourselves has threatened the power that they have in our relationship. And it's one of the weirdest things about the objectification of women because I watch people say, well, he doesn't feel well because he's so tired of taking care of me. And it's like, well, yes, but at no point did he circle that back to, I like, I just feel like as the person who does not feel well, you're not the person that he complains to about that. There are therapists, there are his own mother. Hopefully he has friends or well, I'm not having sex with him because the kids wear me out all day. Oh, okay. And did he lay off when you explained that to him? Like, yes, his pain and his inconvenience is easily explained away, but so is yours. And it's always us making up for those gaps.
Yeah. I also think like some of the things you're mentioning are like the big tropes, right? That, the man is the provider and the woman is like this caretaker who stays home and has like far less responsibilities. And I think that that is in the like huge minority of experience. Like it's become this super prevalent narrative that like that is the way of things or that it was once the way of things. But I think in actuality, that has almost never been the truth. Like I think if we were to dig in, we would find that there's almost no point in history that the average family did not need two incomes to survive. Like this is sort of a mythological time that never really existed and was never really a dynamic except in very wealthy circles where truly the women weren't working. But then they had this whole other set of expectations and responsibilities around hosting. There's, that circle has its own weird expectations of women. But what I'm getting at is like the men on the internet today railing about like gold diggers and wanting a traditional wife with your best buy income. Do you know what I mean? Like where's the gold? Like is my question, because by and large, the men who are espousing these beliefs and that this should be the norm and like this return to quote unquote traditional values do not have the means to even survive on a single income. So it's really interesting that there are these grand ideas that these men have about themselves, but it's fed very much through a right wing media that's very well funded.
Well, I'm glad that you used the term minority because that will become my new mantra when I see it play out in my very Midwestern white lifestyle, where I'll go, okay, this is just a tired trope that Joe Rogan has fed him, and this is how he got the language. And this actually isn't the norm of every woman that I know. This is an instance where I'm like, okay, I can see the Joe Rogan writing on the walls and the Fox News verbiage just spilling from your mouth. And this isn't actually grounded in reality. And I feel like we should start saying that out loud when we hear it, to be like, that's not grounded in reality. Your mother worked. Your mother raised kids while working. Your
Yeah.
mother
Your
was also,
grandmother
yeah,
probably worked. I mean,
exactly.
there's, sure, over the years, your income goes a lot less further than it did. But in reality, like both my grandmothers were like none of the women in my family line were stay at home wives because they could not be like this is not really real. And I think the reason that it resonates with men today, especially young men, is that it feeds this sense of entitlement that I think there's this pivotal age, where a man is kind of transitioning into a version of masculinity that's going to carry through to his life. And I think if you feed this idea that like you're entitled to it all, right? You're the big, strong man. You're the breadwinner. You're the provider. And this woman has to listen to you and shouldn't challenge you and should just do whatever you want and get pregnant with your kids and stay home and make all your food. And somehow you're living comfortably when like none of this is based in reality. These men do not have the income to support this kind of life. This woman does not exist, right? She cannot be both this your idea of what a 50s housewife was, which is wrong, by the way. Like that's not how it looked. But she cannot both be that and these super sexy models that you're finding on OnlyFans, right? Like you there's been this false narrative created, I think, this idea of a lady in the streets and a freak in the sheets. Like, how long have we been hearing that? And I think that there's an idea that that is a person walking around in the world. And I think there is not a clear understanding that, like, the lady in the streets, the woman who is prudish and reserved and isn't, is waiting till marriage or whatever, has these sort of Christian traditional ideas about sex and love and relationships. That is because that is rooted in a shame culture that cannot exist. And like she is not going to magically transform on your wedding night into an OnlyFans girl. That is not real, right? Because those two patterns of behavior each exist for reasons under entirely separate circumstances and under separate ways of moving through the world and understanding on, sexuality and shame, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think all of this is like made up fantasy land. It's made up fantasy land. And I think it feels good for weak men to believe that it exists because they can blame their problems on it.
How are you doing with the new online narrative of well, we abandoned men and the men are in a male loneliness epidemic. And of course, they resent us and are angry at us. And Trump appealed to them because we left the men behind in the gutters.
I think it's easy to hear that and immediately be super activated and angry. I do think it's worth really taking a careful look at what has happened because I believe the men left the men behind. Men are hurting because of the patriarchy. Women are hurting because of the patriarchy. The root of the problems are the same. But when we have things like the Joe Rogan podcast and Andrew Tate constantly messaging to young, impressionable men that actually the root of all their problems is women, right? Women are the problem and they can just sublimate all their anger onto this group of people that are less powerful than them. That's more appealing than going, hey, can you do the really difficult work of looking at yourself and taking accountability for your own character flaws and building up your strengths? That's not clickbaity, right? Um, so I think that men are hurting. I think that is a problem that does exist. But I think that the simplest solution for those men has always been to point the finger at women. And I do not at all believe that women are responsible for that
No.
dynamic.
Well, and then to bring it back to Sapphic horror and Sapphic women, it used to be that men resented and hated in droves Sapphic women the most because they had like gotten out of needing relationships with men or wanting men and they did not desire men. But now, as we see women who are more heteronormative or heterosexual leaning or straight being like, I also can't find anything attracted about you. And you get more social media clickbaity stuff about the 4B movement or whatever. Now it's just like they're not even mad at the one group who like just also decided like we're just not attracted to you. That's not how we're wired. Now they get to be mad at all of us. And of course it would be our fault about it.
Yeah, existing as a sapphic woman, I've seen all shades of the male reaction to that, and I think they're all super interesting. There was when I was growing up, you would hear lesbian thrown around as an insult and like associated with like Rosie O'Donnell, and the implication was that like lesbians are physically unattractive and like what a terrible thing to be. I don't think I hear that as much anymore. Um, but I think that largely men's interface with sapphic women is a little bit non-existent. So
Mhm.
I think it's created in in a mythology, right? So of course you see a lot of fetishization of sapphic women from men. And I think where the anger comes in and potentially the violence is when those same men are forced to confront that this is not a porn setup for them, that actually these women don't need them. And I think that that idea strikes at that same super deep insecurity that like, then I am not important, then I am not valuable, then I feel shame. And so now I'm going to react with like hate and violence. So I think what we mostly see is men just not taking it seriously. So they're like, oh, that's so hot. Or they reach for the lower hanging fruit of like, whatever, you're ugly anyway. um, and I think it does have the potential to escalate even further in a negative direction when men are forced to take the relationship seriously, because now you're striking at that vulnerability of like, oh, you actually don't want me. I also think like the man hating lesbian trope is really interesting because like in my experience, lesbians and sapphic women are really just not that interested in men. Like we're not really sitting around thinking about men. it's just not coming up that much for us. So and I want to acknowledge that I said right in the beginning that I would talk about the book, and then I have not talked about it at all. So I'm going to kind of use this as a bridge to circle back. One of the things that I do in my writing is I think a true decentering of men. So like I have many stories that don't either have no male characters at all, or the male characters are just side characters. They're not central to the story. And to me, that's sort of a reflection of my own journey in first kind of acting with more of a like anger at noticing the ways that men were harming me in the world and in my life at mostly a structural level, but sometimes at an interpersonal level, and being angry and wanting to do that thing that you were talking about in like Promising Young Woman, and where there's like a revenge narrative and like we're going to make them face consequences. So for me, that was sort of a first stage. But I think I've moved into a different stage that is just like, actually, like this group of people is just not very impactful in my life. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel stronger about telling full stories and narratives that simply have very little to do with men. Because I don't need them, right? Um, I don't need them. And that can be difficult for men to hear.
No, and here's the thing, and this is very much how my brain is wired too, where it's like, I'd rather you be angry at me than apathetic towards me. Like the fact that it's like, well, I just don't write about you because you're not important to me, devastating. Would literally lay me out on the floor for days on end. I hope that there are men in my life who have tried to check out this podcast and then cried because there wasn't one episode about them. But to be like, I really thought I had impacted her somehow, but I guess not. Like, I hope, because I find apathy devastating.
No, that's big tough. I think it's easier, and I think most of us have experienced this like after the end of a relationship or something. In some ways, it's easier if the person like hates you and is like saying bad things about you than to grapple with the idea that actually you're just not important to them at all.
Right. Yeah, honestly. So it's almost like apathy is a bigger tool against misogyny and patriarchy than anger, because it's like, well, and no, that's a fucked up thing to say, because then it's like we're not fighting against it. So maybe not against the structure, but the people within the structure to just go, well, actually, the reason why I don't care about your views is because I don't care about them. They're not in any consequence to what I actually feel or think or say, because I do feel like the ultra right and the conservatives, the reason why they're always screaming at us is because all they want is for us to be like, you know what? You're right. Give me my red cap. Fuck women. Fuck women's rights and healthcare. And like, let's get everybody barefoot and back into the kitchen.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and that's where we start to see that group of women making a choice to side with the oppressor. And I don't think that that's a conscious choice. I think that's something that has a lot to do with, how you're raised and your understanding of your own capabilities in the world. And I do empathize with the women out there who probably truly believe on a deep level that they can never be independent or successful on their own, away from being attached to a man. What I do not empathize with, however, is actively voting against your own interests and the interests of other women because you hold those positions. And I think all people as adults have a responsibility to examine their beliefs and reality test them and, weigh harm when you're
Yeah.
making a decision, especially something like a vote that impacts people beyond just you.
My sister and I were having a huge talk about empathy last night at dinner, and how we can look at a woman who is playing into the patriarchy or misogyny and is using that as a shield and a shroud to get through these trying times and because the system is set up to make us so tired and to make us so exhausted and to make us think that siding with patriarchy and, 1950s housewives mythology is the way to go because maybe at some point it would feel less hard than what is currently happening. And I told my sister, I was like, I can empathize all day long, but I also reserve the right to be tired. I also reserve the right to be capped with my involvement in you tearing yourself down and tearing the rights of other women down. And I can empathize all day long, but I reserve the right to think that you're a moron. Like I reserve the right to think that you are the problem as well.
Yeah. And I think what you're describing is something that a lot of people are experiencing right now. And I think it's an impact of compassion fatigue. What I would encourage, women and anyone to do is to really examine like where you are getting these ideas. Because again, I just keep coming back to the fact that none of this is real. These quote unquote trad wife influencers, first of all, examine that statement in your mind. Trad wife influencers who are allegedly spending 8 hours in the day, whatever they're doing, making a strudel by hand from wheat they collected in their backyard or whatever. Um, Understand that this is an influencer who is making easily 6 figures. This is not a trad wife. She is not stay-at-home mom. Look at what these people are wearing, the clothing, their status in life. They are actually the primary breadwinners in their family. These women that are telling you that you should stay at home and not get a job are the primary breadwinners in their upper class families, right? Like none of this is real. And I would also encourage people to look at what the right does to these women, how the right repays their supposed loyalty. We just saw it play out with this semi-successful right-wing influencer who came out and said she had had Elon Musk's child, right? So from her right wing narrative, she did everything right, right? She slept with this powerful man with money. She got pregnant with his child, which he has like a thing, right, about like making all these kids. She did that. She carried this baby. She kept the baby secret, which I'll bet you dollars to donuts was what this powerful man would have wanted. She did all of these things. And was she lauded for this? Was she rewarded by the right? Absolutely not. The moment she says anything, she is dragged across the internet. So like I would just encourage, women who are in this space or any marginalized person who is having thoughts of like, but maybe I could be like the celebrated one in this group or, whatever it is, look at how they treat these people ultimately. Like the leopards eating face party will eat your face too. Like you're not the chosen one.
There's something about this like culture of like if I'm just nice to him enough times, if I'm just more subservient, if I'm just more appeasing, if I'm just like he'll he'll love me and he'll make sure that I live through The Handmaid's Tale. And it's like we were watching two different shows then, baby. Like
No, 100%. They cut off Serena's finger too. Like there's no amount of boot licking that you can do that will save you, right? Because their ultimate goal is to oppress women. It is about power. You look at, it's not even about sexual gratification. You look at what Andrew Tate espouses on the internet, has this massive audience of young men and boys saying things like, if you're having sex for more than 2.5 minutes, it's gay. And the message is that sex and any relationship to women is and can only be about power and dominion. It is not even about sexual gratification because even that is giving the woman too much credit. It is literally only about power and how you can use her body, right? To your own, whatever that is, whether it's cleaning your house, popping out kids, making you dinner, whatever. That is the ultimate goal of the right wing. Um, so I feel for women who are caught up in it. I think that they will get what they voted for. And I also think it's okay to have compassion fatigue and to say, I can't take on too much empathy for this person because me and many others are directly suffering as a result of their choices.
Right. Yeah. The title of the book, I Do Not Apologize for My Position on Men, is so strong. And I did want to ask you, how often have you felt like you've had to apologize for the themes in your book or the things that are important to you?
Yeah. So it's funny. I expected a lot more pushback when I released the book with this title, but I think part of it is that I've released many other books at this point, and I think I've built up. I'm by no means, any kind of influencer or any influential person in the writing world. Caveat. However, in my small circles on social media, I do think I've been very vocal about being someone who is not going to like listen to any bullshit. So that situation with the podcaster that ended with me publicly outing what had happened on the internet, that was years ago. He was completely ousted, is gone from the community. And it's happened with one other man as well. So I think, and this is again just a guess on my part, that the would be men, right, to drag me have realized that maybe I'm not a great target for that. So I haven't gotten a lot of pushback on this book, but I do still get I'm telling you, it's always the weirdest things. Um, I posted about cheese curds once and I made a lot of men really angry. I didn't know that like there were such strong opinions. I made a video about, encouraging people not to panic and pull all their money out of their 401ks right now because the stock market is, not doing well at the moment. And I got a lot of shit for that. So like it's more for me when a man feels I have stepped out of my rightful lane, right? But when I'm directly talking about men, they shut the fuck up mostly. Like for me anyway.
It's so funny because when I was living in Dayton, I had such a comfortable echo chamber around me. It was me and all queer women and people of color. And I had, by the time I moved last August, I had all but eradicated toxic masculinity in my personal life, where it's like, I'm not going to engage with men who make me uncomfortable and keep them in my friend group and keep giving energy to like, well, maybe they'll be good one day, or maybe I'm the person who can teach them the way or whatever. And then I moved back home and now I'm in Indiana and it's very white and it's very straight here. And every day I go, damn, I wish I could go back to the Pink Pony Club where
I bet.
I had created a home where truly my cat every day is like, why am I looking at another man? You promised me this would never happen. I go, I did. I promised myself that would never happen. And look where we are. Like, yeah,
Yeah. I feel for you. I mentioned I'm in Florida, but I'm very fortunate to be in a blue dot in Florida, so I don't have to contend with that kind of stuff overwhelmingly, right? There's some of it, of course. But that's super tough.
it's super tough. And I also know that like part of it is that my online community and my creative circle is so strong that there's so much safety in that I'm not going to book club every month in Indiana trying to be like, maybe I could find someone who is also upset about our current existence or whatever, because I'm like, well, I have tons of friends. They just all happen to be on the computer and my phone, and that's fine. And I know that I'll get there. I can feel myself already being like, how do I start building an in person community in the current that does not only include my toddler nephew and his newborn brother and me teaching them the good word of Celine Dion. To be like, this is my culture and it's important to me and it'll be important to you too. But one of the last things that I want to touch on before we kind of move into our closing out ceremony is you had asked specifically about combating misogyny within queer relationships through your writing and in your own life.
Yeah, so I think in the same ways we already talked about that these patriarchal ideas and systems and patterns of behavior seep in a way that like it's not always super clear to people, and I've seen it seep into the Sapphic community in different ways. And um one of the things that I find myself writing about a lot are toxic Sapphic couples and the patterns of behavior that they are playing out, that I think our current patriarchal society really feeds into. For example, just like the idea that there is a chaser and a chased, right? So like, and usually it's the man is supposed to like chase the woman, and the woman is supposed to be resistant to that and like coy and whatever. I think it's interesting to explore those ideas and dynamics with femme characters. And what I'm hoping to do is not only to decenter men from my work in these stories, but show like, hey, this is a little more like nefarious than it seems on its face. Like there are elements of this that we can carry with us and do carry with us unless we do the active work to recognize like, oh, I am recreating a power dynamic that is actually really unhealthy and patriarchal and like doesn't need to exist, right? The idea that like one person should be the one who pays for the dates and it's generally going to be like the more masculine one, like these power laden things. Queer people have a really unique opportunity to throw out those scripts and create something new and different. So yeah, I think to me it's more interesting, and obviously I'm biased, but I think it's more interesting to look at these things through a queer lens, because it's much more obvious in a queer context that these things don't need to exist because we're not as socially programmed to just accept them at face value.
No, for sure. And I think when people can understand that, like, you know, the writing is coming from, or the call is coming from inside the house or whatever, where you're looking at queer relationships that really have no reason to live inside of these patriarchal norms, but somehow, maybe through no fault of anyone, still end up do, then it's like, what more evidence do you need that this abusive system is insidious and it is so normalized? Because a lot of times I think that we're just told that we're being really dramatic about it and nothing is truly that bad.
Totally. And, it's funny. One of the, not really complaints, but things I've heard a few times about the collection is people saying, well, I kind of thought there'd be more shitty men in it, which like, I hear you. I
Yeah.
get why you would think that. But actually, so the framing device I use for the collection is that the opening and closing stories are fictionalized versions of real things that real men did. So that's on purpose. But for the most part, those stories in the middle, like, are not your typical good for her. A guy is shitty and she stabs him at the end type of stories. And cause I want people to lean in and look closer and recognize like, oh, okay, like these are the behaviors, these are the things that have carried over. This person is acting this way probably because of these systems that are in place, right? So we can see beyond just guy is shitty, girl is victim, because it's so much more entrenched than that.
Yeah. It's so funny because now I'm rethinking about one that I've read, which is, correct me if I get the title wrong because I don't have
Sure.
anything in front of me. I'm Not the Ghost You Wanted. Is that the
Yeah.
correct title?
Yeah.
And how it plays on the trope that, like, get the U-Haul ready because, we're going to move quickly as a Sapphic couple. And I think about personal times in my life where I've watched women transition from dating men to dating women. And then all of a sudden they're like, I'm going to move a million miles an hour in the relationship. And sometimes my like secret shitty thought is this the first time that someone's been nice to you in a relationship?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times the answer is yes. And I think so for anyone listening who hasn't read it, the premise of the story is essentially that this Sapphic couple sort of makes a promise lightheartedly, that like, oh, well, I'll be with you forever. And if you died, I would haunt you. Ha ha ha. And then one of them dies and is stuck haunting their partner. And it's kind of this, I'm not the ghost you wanted here. Like you were in love with somebody else. The love part is dead. The shine has worn off. And I think that the question I want to ask is like, um, how about the promises that we make to each other, right? And the reasons that we're making them. Because I think that there is this impulse in relationships to like promise the moon and promise it early, whether it's a sapphic relationship or is that just a mirror of what we've seen since growing up. Like every princess movie is like she meets Prince Charming and then they get married. That's the next thing. Is like I
Yeah.
promise it's forever. And what does it mean when we promise forever? And how critically do we think before we make that promise to a person?
Well, and I think a modernized version of the Disney movies that we all watched is honestly Love is Blind and Married at
Oh my
First
God.
Sight, where it's like we're sitting in a
Yes.
pod. We've gotten really deep, really hard within 4 days, and now we're getting married because we're in love. And what I see countless times on Love is Blind and Married at First Sight is men get on the other side of either the engagement or the marriage and immediately go, wait, is this real? And then you're like, yeah, buddy. But I see women be more built, like bought into the process because I'm like, well, yeah, this has been normalized for women. You meet a man, you charm him enough that he marries you. That is the goal. And you need to move quickly before he realizes that you might not be the one that he wants to marry, but you also have to play it cool. But Married at First Sight and Love is Blind has kind of taken the cool girl factor out of it because you're on their schedule and timeline. And it's really interesting to watch how women and men go differently into that process.
I just want to say I'm so happy you brought up Love is Blind. I'm obsessed with it because when you watch them in the pause, you can watch this happen in every single episode where they obviously cannot see each other. One is saying something, the other is saying something else, and you can watch them both imagine how the other person is responding and it's not what's really responding. So you can
No.
watch them in real time create these fantasy versions of the other person. And of course, without fail, watch it implode when they get together in real life. And, I know we're just about out of time, but I think another sort of social conditioning thing that I would love for especially women to really examine is this idea that like you are incomplete or have failed if you are not married or in a long-term relationship.
Yeah.
And to ask yourself, is this really the goal for my life? Is that really my ultimate goal? Knowing everything that we know about the impact of marriage on women, which by the way, if you don't know, means poorer outcomes on every single metric, health, happiness, length of life, quality of life, all of it. Women perform more poorly, men perform more positively. Marriage benefits men. It does not benefit women. So like to really examine, is that something I want? And to challenge this idea that like women need to go out and find a man who will agree to marry them instead of asking questions like, who do you want to be as a woman? What do you want your life to look like? But instead, I think unfortunately so many people just run full speed into like, need to get a man, need to like get a man to give me a ring.
Well, we do have a little closing out tradition on To All the Men I've Tolerated Before, where we kind of synthesize our biggest lesson from the conversation or about your experience in queer literature and horror literature and being a published author who's also using the internet to promote your sapphic horror stories and things like that. So if you wanted to impart a lasting lesson on the audience, what would you try to impart on them?
I would just encourage folks to look closer. I think the idea that feminism is just like angry women who don't like men not only dismisses the clear merits of feminism as a movement, but it also makes makes people a lot more able to get away with things and continue to enact male violence and continue to uphold systems that oppress women. And I think, just to circle back quickly to the Blake Lively thing, it's the perfect example of this playing out. So I would just encourage people to think more critically about what's on your For You page, and know that, like, these things can come in really egregious forms, and they can also come in really subtle, ambiguous forms. And yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, I think I'm just going to sign off on that one too, because I was going to be like, yeah, we have to start paying attention to where our narratives are coming from. Like, it is no longer cute to tell me, well, I'm loyal to Fox News because I enjoy what they're telling me. It's like, well, we know the news and the media is painting a story that will be sensationalized. So you feel validated in the shitty ways that you believe. Like,
Mhm.
we got to be critical thinkers at some point. And I think because I have an education background, I used to be a teacher early in my career. I think one of the things too that we have to kind of grasp as a society is that this is more on us. It is on us to educate ourselves, to make sure that we have a diverse background in the authors and the shows and the movies that we are partaking in, because part of our extreme conservative nature that's currently going on in this country is they are dumbing down education and critical thinking and critical response on purpose. The education that you and I went through in elementary and high school, non-existent in the current
Mhm.
day and age.
Yeah.
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 They're barely teaching kids how to read at this point.
It's scary.
It's scary. Yeah. So if you're a parent out there, you might want to start taking your kids' reading comprehension into your own hands, because they're basically teaching kids to memorize how to read books for tests. Then it's scary. Talk to your kids about the Little Mermaid and why it's creepy. Be like, this is creepy. She's 14, just so you know. you know? What would be a manifestation that you would like to offer up to the collective?
Oh, that women are really powerful. Women, non-binary folks, our trans community. Um, I think a really amazing thing that I want to do this year, and I think that a lot of us could do this year, is just invest in ourselves, um, and continue to grow and be wonderful, set ourselves up for success, and do everything we can not to drown in the tidal wave, of bad news that's coming at us all the time.
Yeah. Yesterday was International Women's Day, to kind of give a timestamp on when we're recording. And I think my manifestation is just going to be, I hope we're taking time to love ourselves and love each other, because I think, like, I'm starting to feel the exhaustion and we're only in March of year one. And I can feel my patience start to dwindle and start to thin. And I can feel every day just be a list of things that I have to live through or get through until it's time to go to bed again. And so I hope there's at least one person currently in your in person community that's making you feel loved and valued and affirming with you that this is not okay. I mean, Ray, this was wonderful. I knew it was going to be. Um, which is like a know-it-all thing to say at the end of my own show. Like, good producing, Natalie. But
No, I love that.
you were a fantastic guest. I'm so glad that TikTok brought you to my feed, and that once again you were a person who's like, I am going to click on this woman's profile who just dropped in a comment. I have a podcast and I think we'd be friends. So
Totally.
thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. This was super fun.
Yeah. And please plug anywhere and everywhere that our listeners can find you.
Great. So I'm Ray Wild, mostly on Instagram and TikTok. I have a Blue Sky, but I'm not really there. My next book coming out is called I Can Fix Her. It is a sapphic horror, sort of sci-fi leaning story about a toxic relationship and second chance at romance gone very, very wrong. So I'm super excited for that release. If you like the sound of I Do Not Apologize for My Position on Men, do pick it up sooner rather than later because I was just informed that the publisher is shutting down. So it will go out of print in June, if not sooner, depending on if I find it another home, et cetera, et cetera. So all that to say, if it sounds super cool to you, maybe grab it because I can't promise it will be consistently available for in the near future.
Yes, and that's always important about like understand. I feel like one of the things that I have to keep in the back of my mind is that just because I have a vast knowledge in many different things and how things work doesn't mean like that the person that I'm going to have coffee with later understands how the book publishing world works. And I'm like, no, you have to like keep up with stuff like that and whatnot. So yeah, that was important to note. So thank you
Yeah.
because I do want everyone to have access to this in all of your books. And tolerators, you know where to find us. It's been I've Tolerated Pod on Instagram, Natalie K124 for my personal Instagram and TikTok. And then I'm also on Blue Sky, but I don't know how to use it and I don't know if I'm being good at it. So I guess give us a chance. And we're on YouTube too. And remember, tolerators, you don't have to smile through anything you're tolerating, including living through the handmaid's tale, but being told that it's a utopia every day that's leading us to the correct place. Smiles are for joy.